Last time we talked about methodology, and today what I want to do is give you an example of the experimental method, the method that psychologists use to really look at causation by making manipulations of independent variables and measuring dependent variables. The example I'm going to use is a wonderful book by Vincent Detier at Princeton called To Know a Fly. Yes, To Know a Fly. Vincent Detier was actually a biologist but studied behavior, and he was interested in behavior of insects. And he wrote this book about the research he did with ordinary houseflies. Now, he pointed out in the book that working with houseflies is really great. First, they're cheap. You just put a piece of liverwurst on your windowsill and you come back and there'll be plenty of flies there. It's also one of those things where if you're doing animal research, in this case with insects, no one really cares about animal rights. In fact, we try to rid the house of flies. He has to worry about people coming into his office and swatting them away. Houseflies. And I want to talk now about research he did on how flies eat, how they feed, how they know they're hungry, and how they know that they're full and they have to stop eating. So the facilitation of feeding behavior and the inhibition of feeding behavior in the housefly. Now, we're going to use the experimental method that we talked about in the last video. We're going to make observations about how the fly eats. We're going to develop hypotheses or research questions. We're going to do manipulations to see whether or not a hypothesis is correct. And then we'll make conclusions after some analysis of data. So here's a fly. You've all seen them, maybe not this big, but you've all seen them. The first thing Detier had to do was figure out how he could have the fly do things that he wanted them to do. So what he did was he took some wax and he simply attached a handle to the fly. Then he could move the fly around and do what he wanted the fly to do. Now, we're interested in feeding behavior, and it's easy to tell when flies or other insects of this type are eating because they have a mouth which is called a proboscis. And when they're feeding, the proboscis really unrolls and they suck the food through the proboscis. So if the proboscis is down, the fly is eating, and if the proboscis is up, the fly is not eating. So it's an easy way to tell whether the behavior that we're interested in, feeding or eating, is occurring. So then he put the fly over some sugar water, took the handle, and simply lowered the fly into the sugar water, and it noticed that as soon as the feet of the fly touched the water that has sugar in it, the proboscis came out and the fly ate. Lifted the fly out of the water, proboscis rolled back up. Drop it down into the water, proboscis came out, and the fly was eating. So, hypothesis. Made observations, now we've come up with an hypothesis. The fly tastes with its feet. You're saying, oh, come on. If I was really hungry and you lowered me over a big bowl of ice cream, I would probably eat too because I could see the ice cream, I could smell, and all of those sensory cues are important in determining eating behavior. So he did an experiment. He took another bowl that had plain water and moved it very, very close to the sugar water. So I could have the feet in one and the proboscis in the head in the other. So take a hungry fly, we put it so its feet are touching the sugar water, even though its head and proboscis are over plain water, the fly eats. We turn it around, so now the proboscis is over sugar water, and the feet are in plain water, the fly does not eat. Sugar water, feet, it eats. Plain water, feet, it doesn't eat. Eats, doesn't eat. Eats, so it makes a manipulation of where the feet are, and that determines whether the fly eats, not where the head and the proboscis are. So the fly does taste with its feet. In fact, in one experiment, he took a little bit of sugar water and put it on the top of the foot of the fly and let it roll down until it reached the hairs on the tip of the fly's feet, and only then did the proboscis come out and the fly eat. So they seem to be taste receptors located in the feet of the fly. Now, so we know what initiates feeding behavior in the fly, and that is presence of food at the tip of the foot of the fly. But how does the fly know that it's full and stops eating? Well, one thing we can do is sort of stuff the fly and see whether it feeds. That's very hard to do because stuffing food through that proboscis, which is a very fragile organ, is very difficult. But fortunately, the fly has another entrance, and so we simply push food into the gut of the fly from the rear end until it's absolutely stuffed. Then we lower the fly over the sugar water, and the fly eats. So it's not just the presence of food in the gut of the fly that makes it to stop eating, but what does? Well, they fooled around observing the fly. It has an exoskeleton, so if you look between the exoskeleton up and around the esophagus of the fly where it goes into the gut, you notice a nerve there, a nerve that you can almost see. And the nerve goes to the ganglion or brain of the fly. So it says maybe that nerve is important. So do an experiment. We simply go in and cut that nerve, sever it from the brain of the fly, and guess what? The fly eats. And it eats and it eats. As long as there's food, the fly will eat. It doesn't stop eating. And the fly is so big that it actually might explode. So we now know what starts feeding, and by doing experiments, we know what starts feeding in the fly. That is taste on the feet, if it's hungry. And we know what stops feeding in the fly, presence of the food in the connection between the gut and the esophagus. It stimulates a nerve that goes to the brain and tells it to stop eating. Excitation from the feet, inhibition from this nerve located in the throat. So we understand feeding behavior in the fly, and Dieter learned that. Thank you.